Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizer. I'm quite pleased to be here. And at a fundamental level, what I am presenting today is a study of ownership rather than anything else. So I spend considerably less time about the production and dissemination of this particular book than I do about one particular collector. And this is a professor, an Aristotelian figure in the University of Helmstedt, and it's my main point today. So the book itself is the Little Catechism of Luther, which, as you know, it was a propulsive little book that every pastor had in a saddlebag, especially if you were missionizing abroad in Americas and so on. And this particular edition was different insofar, first of all, that it was a sort of clandestine production spearheaded by a Jesuit, Laurentius Nicolai, the Norwegian Jesuit, to whom I return in 10 minutes or so. But it also had the difference that it took away all the illustrations of the German edition, the Tafeldrucke, and it just took away from that, and it implemented the edition with the remarks of another Jesuit, Sigmund M. Hofer. And this is makes it a very interesting, apart from being translated into Swedish, because it was produced in the context of a Missio Suetica, which by then, in 1591, was already sort of declining. I mean, Nicolai was expulsed from Sweden at the end of the previous, I mean, by 1580, he was back in Rome, and then situated himself in Prague and in the Czech lands and so on. But the interesting thing is that the combination of these remarks by the Jesuit M. Hofer and Luther Little Catechism makes it a peculiar book, and he conflates the edition to about 113 pages in octavo. Now, this book emigrates along with very, very few of the book produced at the Officina of the Jesuits in Vilnius to Helmstedt. And the owner, as I said, is a Swedish professor whose name is Nicolaus André Granius, and he was born at about 2 hours southwest of Uppsala, still in Uppsala country, and he intervened when he was hired in Helmstedt at the Academia Julia. He intervened in ethics, so he's known for his contribution in ethics, also in cosmology. He was informed of Galileo's observation in 1611 because he had a papal fellowship that brought him to Olomouc. So he was sort of trained there early on. And he also read, it was one of the very few early readers of Kepler. So his figure is interesting because of this strange combination. And I should also mention that Granius was essentially a crypto-Catholic in a sense that he operated in a Lutheran environment, but he was befriended probably in Olomouc and other places, many Catholics, and so he was partial to that even during his job, which he kept until 1631 when he died. So we'll get back to Helmstedt and Granius a little bit later, but I wanted to just begin with a couple of introductory remarks. And first is to sort of plunge you into a very old map of, this is the map of confessionalization. You have the deep blue Lutheran spaces, which as you can see are slightly slanted towards Switzerland, and they are meant to give you a visual representation of how things got fuzzier in area like Moravia or yes, like Bohemia, Moravia, because of the action of Calvinists and Socinians, among other observations that one can make. It's also evident that this map is trying to make a big deal of Pomerania and Brandenburg for various political ideological reasons. But interestingly, the bibliography about the mobility of print, the mobility has changed in recent years, and we now, I think, we pay much less attention to confessionalization as a primary matrix, and we do think of institutions, scientific institutions. This is an example of Goclenius, who collected sort of works in the Aristotelian tradition, especially the pseudo-Aristotelian tradition of the problemata and the rhetoric. And in the quote that I underlined there, he makes Ramus agree with Aristotle. Now, this is a peculiar little fact because in the Academy of Helmstedt, the agreement, I mean, the Aristotelians were fervently basically anti-Ramist, and Granius, the collector of the Vilnius book, falls into this category, but at the same time, they were experimenting with, especially with how to put together the pedagogical instruments of the Ramist, especially the tables, in the service of Aristotelian ethics and cosmology. So it's interesting, the larger point of this is simply that because of this métissage, if you will, you have a lot of, an area of preservation of scholastics, which is interesting along with the study of Venetian materials. I mean, the University of Padua, that is to say Paduan Aristotelian textbooks, which are the bread and butter of this kind of teaching in the University of Helmstedt. So we will see that the collector of the Lutheran Enchiridion is in fact a person who is very innovative precisely in attaching his pedagogical course into the legacy of authors like Zabarella himself and also Francesco Piccolomini. And if there was more time, this could be, I mean, an interesting topic for discussion. Now, since the publication of Hodgson Commonplace Learning, it has become sort of, largely topical to discuss Ramism as mostly a pedagogical innovation, rather than, say, a hermeneutical strategy or a purely theoretical one. It's interesting in the various quotes that I highlighted from this text that, according to Hodgson, the spread of Ramism in Germany, it was something different from the confessional boundaries, something, that actually operated spontaneously, he writes, without any salesmanship on the part of the Ramists themselves. And especially from, not so much, it's not only from the periphery to the center, but it's also on a lower scale of the social ladder. So you have the kind of, the academic hierarchy of Ramism in this part of the Holy Roman Empire is distinctively humble. So you have Latin gymnasia that really sort of propel the ramification of this knowledge. And again, a similar principle in the course of the book, you have the impression that Hodgson essentially works a kind of Latourian trick, in a sense that he makes the center and periphery, he almost uses a periphery center model, so a center periphery that is twisted on its own head. And I think this makes some degree of sense, but there are also, again, limitations related to the fact that he only understands Ramism as a pedagogical tool. Now, there could be other visualization. This is a map provided by my friend Vladimir Urbanek, who writes on the, for many years has worked on Comenius, and this is a map he prepared of roughly 565 letters in the network. This is another way to visualize the map, which is largely the same map. I mean, there were Comenian scholars at the University of Helmstedt who were personally known to Granius. And there was a discussion documented in the margins of Granius' library about Comenius and about reformation of methodology, and the Herborn encyclopedist as well. I should say that the library of Granius is about 600 or 700 volumes today, divided between Wolfenbüttel and Helmstedt itself, where in the old university collection you still have legal and mostly legal books and history books. Now, the thing that interests me the most is really the idea that marginalia play a role in the transmission of these books. And this is largely what I mean, given the time, I can only speak about this today, as you will see in just a few minutes. It is well known that marginalia commanded a value in the market. The most typical example would be Tycho Brahe, because he wanted to acquire in bulk the library of Paul Wittig, the Polish mathematician, and there were many copies made of that, and eventually the bid of Tycho was unsuccessful. But the idea is that a book such as Adam Mosley presents the sort of dissemination of astronomical knowledge mostly as a succession of printed editions, instruments. As you know, Tycho, when he had to go south, he followed pretty much the Melanchtonian system of universities until he found his way to Prague. But there's also, I think, a separate value is in the copies that were annotated and owned, and it possess a kind of personal story that readers were interested, elite readers were interested in acquiring, in copying, and incorporating. So the annotations were incorporated in a kind of commonplace books and notebooks of private of use also in private academies. So now I get to the main case study, which is really this book now in Wolfenbüttel, which is a single edition, is not in any sort of Sammelband. Now this is fairly atypical for Granius, because Granius, because of, well, for economic reasons, as well as to create a sort of dialogue between the interesting parallel genres, it tends to bind a lot of editions together. There could be many, many examples of that. He usually typically adopts parchment, reuse parchment, and also pigskin, like white pigskin, softer sort of binding. But at the same time, this Enchiridion of Luther is a standalone. And these are the readable annotations of Granius in the margins of the text. So we can spend a minute or two just looking at them. He notes contradiction in Luther's doctrine in reference to a discussion later on in the book. There are an interesting feature of this book is that the annotations are in Latin and Swedish. And as far as I am aware, this is a fairly unique situation. In another case, after the 1610s or so, there is a collection of runic inscriptions that actually comes to Helmstedt, where Granius is supposed to give a sort of an opinion back to the Swedish court. And so he writes that letter in Swedish, which is now in a miscellaneous manuscript at the Augusta Bibliothek. But it's fairly unusual to have him writing annotations in Swedish and Latin back to back. And I think that this is an indication that the book was used personally and it didn't have a particularly distinct pedagogical function in teaching. Many of the books of Granius, as we will see in a few slides, were annotated by students, and so there was a kind of circle. And in a way, as people, for example, scholars such as Asaf Bentov, among others, there is the idea that in the University of Helmstedt, there were private groups or private academies, if you want to call them, around a teacher, around a professor who operated with his, for example, collections of disputationes, student disputations, and other such documents. Now, Granius seems to echo from the Jesuit text attached to Luther, a polemic against the falsis concionatoribus. So there is this preoccupation with truth, mendacity, mendaxi, contradiction. Also, a key word in the marginalia is calumnia. So again, it's the idea, it's this kind of rhetorical reading. Facile proba turpitudo qui ingeniose maledicis adversario suo. Or again, another interesting annotation is on 55 recto, where we read that Luther was not pontificating in his prior writings, such as this one, and also the retractatio, another rhetorical aspect. Luther non retractavit ut Dominus Augustinus. So he makes this kind of connection with the style of preaching in this little catechism compared to Augustine. So again, there is this sort of strange, very minuscule. I mean, I understand this is a fragment, is nothing more than a footnote, but it's a footnote of an interesting situation where you have an Aristotelian teacher reacting to a Lutheran book from a position of crypto-Catholic persuasion, and actually noting in the text certain key elements which resonate with the Aristotelian theory, also the idea of the demonstratio potissima. Teaching Luther is in the marginalia at the end of the volume. There is also, as is typical of Granius, there's also an index glued to the last page of the book. It says that Luther teaches ex scientia certa. Now, these are words that really sort of have a function, because they identify the sort of highest syllogistic demonstration, which is what the Paduan Aristotelian would only identify with the prior analytics of Aristotle. Now, I'll just go a little bit faster for time, but I wanted to, at this point, zoom out a bit of this minuscule example, which may or may not be of interest to you. But the interesting part is really to reflect on the ideological uses of the Swedish Enchiridion. I could say more. I mean, I actually plan to say very little about the first of this point, because I think it's not necessary here. A little bit more about Nikolai could be interesting in a sense that this Norwegian Jesuit was educated at the University of Leuven in the 50s. Socialism, befriended Robert Bellarmine, and then he was a very controversial figure. He was sent to a sort of, again, a very provocative Catholic mission to reclaim, I mean, the part of Scandinavia, particularly Sweden, and he spent a couple of years in Norway, fighting with the university authority, and then the rest of the decade in Sweden at the court. And according to Oscar Garstein, who wrote a fundamental book about this figure in the context of Queen of Christina, this is something that he worked on fairly about 40 years ago. He suggests that Laurentius Nicolai may have had a role in actually changing, disposing the mind, the heart of Christina into, I mean, before the abdication, but I mean into the sort of development. And then, well, the major point is really just how do we, if I have a few extra minutes, how do we insert what Granius did to the Luther Enchiridion in the context of his Nachlass? And now this is, so I'll spend 4 or 5 minutes trying to give you a sense of this figure and how it worked. First of all, as I mentioned, there is a strong connection with the Paduan tradition. If you start to read the slides from the bottom up, you see a kind of statement by Zabarella, which comes very, very close to empiricism. This has been studied by various authors, especially Marcos Garbi, who wrote and pretty much persuasively showing that this is the foundation that will be taken on later on by English natural philosophers to try to make Zabarella sort of sound like a precursor of empiricism. And he says, what you learn from the senses, illud quod sensu cognoscitur, certassime cognoscitur, you know that in a very strong way, although not fortasse exactissime. So it's lower than the syllogistic sort of demonstratio potissima, but nevertheless is strong enough. And there are comments in a set of disputations presided by Granius. This one is the 8th thesis of 1617, where Granius says, "Cognoscitur secundo per visum esse album, idem gustatur, cognoscitur tertio esse dulce." So there are sort of ways to learn the properties of something, and it's clear that his analytical lexicon is influenced by Paduans like Zabarella and Piccolomini again. Now, Piccolomini is also present here because you have a sort of chart of the subalternation of the sciences, which cannot come. I mean, it must be in an echo of the so-called Quaestio de Certitudine Mathematicarum, which is one of the fundamental sort of iconic moments of the Paduan Aristotelians. That is to say, where do you place mathematics and in a subordinate role, music in the scheme of the sciences. And so this is also the principal reason why Aramist and Aristotelian were meant to disagree or perhaps agree if you follow Goclenius. Now, this is another document, and I come to my conclusion rather quickly. This is the original document when Granius was hired as a teacher by the Duke. And it's interesting because in the document, which is now preserved at the State Archive of Lower Saxony, you see that Granius was supposed to teach ethics, and so mathematics and cosmology are just implemented later on, and even the religious aspect, he had no role to play from a purely, a sort of administrative point of view. Now, this is an example of Granius using the spaces of the book to promote tables. Anne Blair, in her book on Jean Bodin, which is, the first book Anne Blair published about 30 years ago, is her dissertation. She mentioned Granius as she says something like is a semi-Ramist. I don't know what she means by that, but semi-Ramist is something sort of, interesting in the sense that sometimes you see Granius try to apply a dichotomy, a pure dichotomy in the tabular section of his annotations, but then he loses this principle later on, and so you have, for example, in that example, you have a different sort of organization, but it still remains a sort of a slight imitation of the kind of books that were produced and sold in Helmstedt from the mainly from the Frankfurt Fair. So books like kind of reprint. Yes, I have 1 minute. I'll try to do my best. So I have just to conclude, I will give you a sense that Granius produces three kind of annotations. Folia, which is to say something that he produces on another piece of paper external to the book. He also works on the verba in the Erasmian sense of res and verba, and he also does diagrams. And so there is this kind of figura, the third element of Granius. And I'll skip this part, but in the conclusion, I just wanted, with yet another example, the last 30 seconds or so, I wanted to just say two things. One is that the Lutheran Enchiridion, if it proves anything at all, it proves that we cannot make a distinction between the sensoriality that is traditionally attached to Catholic practitioners and the Lutherans. Because in the end, you have these objects that really become very tangible, very physical. And so I would, even though Granius himself was, as I said, a sort of crypto-Catholic, but in a sense, as Ulinka Rublack wrote, there is this culture of contact. There is this materiality that actually cuts across. And so that's one point. The other point is ego documents. Do we treat this as a kind of, as scholars are very used, especially the Italian ones, because they work on artisans like Florentine people and so on. But is this really an ego document? Is this a kind of biographical narrative, or is this something else? Now, I was recently in Istanbul talking about something completely different, but it was interesting that for those who look at Central Asia and the Ottoman empires and so on, this kind of narratives, I mean, the use of margins are really part of a larger tradition of life writing. And I think that life writing, to my mind, is just a better, more cohesive, more sort of attractive, perhaps, way to define this kind of documents, rather than doing the old sort of scholarship on self-fashioning and, ego documents and so on. So this is just, I leave it like that. Sorry, maybe 21 minutes, but thank you.